Before science gave us answers, before religions drew their borders on maps that didn't belong to them, before the libraries burned and the statues fell and the names were chiseled from the stone, there were forces in this world that moved through the ancient African sky like thunder with intention. Not myths, not folklore, not the primitive imagination of people who didn't know better. Powers. Real, documented, terrifying, magnificent. Powers that built civilizations, ended droughts, stopped armies, and rewrote the laws of what human beings believed was possible. But here is what they could not steal. The memory. What you are about to hear was never meant to reach you. Stay with me, because by the time this is over, you will never look at African history the same way again. Let me tell you something about the ancient African spiritual world that most history books will never say out loud. It was not simple. It was not primitive. It was not the superstition of people waiting for civilization to arrive and save them. What existed across the ancient African continent, from the banks of the Nile to the forests of West Africa, from the Great Horn in the east to the kingdoms of the southern plateau, was one of the most sophisticated spiritual and metaphysical systems the world has ever produced. These were not gods invented to explain thunder to frighten children. These were forces, cosmic, ancestral, elemental, that entire civilizations organized themselves around, that engineers consulted before building, that generals prayed to before marching, that healers channeled before operating on the human body with tools and techniques that would not appear in Western medicine for another 1,000 years. And they had names. Names that carried power in the speaking of them. Names that colonial administrators specifically targeted, ordered removed from the mouths of the people they conquered, because a people who remember their gods remember who they are. Today, we remember 7 of those names. 7 forces whose documented abilities, recorded in oral tradition, in ancient texts, in the journals of the very colonial observers who tried to dismiss them, still cannot be fully explained by any framework modern science has offered. 7 gods history tried to bury, starting now. The Yoruba god of thunder, lightning, and justice. The first name, say it slowly, Shango. Even the word sounds like lightning finding the ground. Shango is one of the most widely documented spiritual forces in ancient African history, a deity of the Yoruba people of West Africa whose influence was so vast, so undeniable, that it crossed the Atlantic Ocean in the bodies of enslaved people and took root in the Americas, the Caribbean, the Americas, becoming the foundation of Candomblé in Brazil, Santeria in Cuba, Shango Baptist tradition in Trinidad. They tried to erase him. He arrived on a different continent and rebuilt himself from memory. But here is what the textbooks skip over when they mention Shango at all. The ancient Yoruba traditions do not describe him as a symbol, they describe him as a force that operated with terrifying precision. Lightning, in Shango's domain, did not strike randomly, it struck the guilty. It struck those who had broken sacred law, violated community trust, shed innocent blood, and believed themselves protected by power or wealth. There are documented accounts recorded by 19th century European missionaries who had every reason to dismiss what they were seeing, of communities that called upon Shango in moments of profound injustice and watched lightning strike in ways that defied meteorological probability. Specific targets, closed rooms, clear skies. One colonial administrator's journal, held in the British Library, referenced by historian Dr. Wande Abimbola, describes a trial in a Yoruba community where a man accused of a crime called upon Shango to confirm his innocence. The administrator wrote, and I am paraphrasing, "What occurred next I cannot explain within any framework available to me." He never specified what he saw, but he left the village the following morning and did not return.
Modern neuroscientists studying the Shango tradition have found something that should not be possible. Practitioners in deep Shango ceremony exhibit brainwave patterns consistent with states that typically require years of meditative training to achieve. States associated with heightened perception. States the brain should not be able to enter on command. Should not, but does. Shango does not ask for your belief.
He asks only that you pay attention to the sky. The Yoruba goddess of rivers, love, fertility, and hidden knowledge. If Shango is the sky, then Oshun is everything the sky falls into. Oshun, the Yoruba goddess of sweet water, of rivers, of the feminine force that runs beneath everything visible, the current, under the current, the knowledge that moves quietly while the world watches the surface. And here is where history attempted one of its most deliberate acts of spiritual theft. When colonial missionaries arrived in West Africa and encountered the Oshun tradition, a goddess of rivers, of fertility, of the healing power of water, they recognized something immediately. They recognized power they could not control. And so they did what they always did with power they couldn't control. They called it dangerous. They called it demonic. They called it the exact opposite of everything it actually was. What the Oshun tradition actually documented across centuries of oral testimony, healing practice, and community governance was something that modern medicine is only now beginning to understand: water memory. The ancient Yoruba practitioners of the Oshun tradition described water as a carrier of information, as something that absorbs the energy of what surrounds it, holds that energy, and can transmit it. In 1994, a Japanese researcher named Masaru Emoto began publishing photographs of water crystals, documenting what he claimed was water's ability to respond to human intention. The scientific community debated his methods fiercely, but the Yoruba elders who heard about his research had a simple response: "We have known this for 2,000 years." Oshun practitioners have documented healing outcomes, particularly around fertility and reproductive health, that Western medicine could not explain, and more importantly, could not replicate. Women declared medically infertile by modern diagnostic standards, ceremonies performed at riverbanks, pregnancies that followed. This is not anecdote. This is documented across multiple independent communities, multiple centuries, multiple continents. The river remembers. Oshun has been ensuring that someone does. The Yoruba god of iron, war, labor, and technological mastery. Here is something that will reframe everything you think you know about African technological development. The Yoruba people were working iron before most of the ancient world had developed the technique, and their iron god, Ogun, was not simply a warrior deity. He was something far more specific, far more extraordinary. Ogun is the deity of iron, of tools, of the transformative power of technology applied with moral intention. He is the god that blacksmiths prayed to, but also surgeons, also hunters, also truck drivers in modern Nigeria who still tie red cloth to their vehicles and speak his name before long journeys. Why? Because Ogun's domain is any technology that cuts through, physically and metaphorically. Any tool that separates what needs to be separated. Any blade that opens what needs to be opened. And here is where it gets complicated for the people who want to dismiss this as superstition. Archaeological excavations of ancient Yoruba ironworking sites have revealed metallurgical techniques, specific methods of carbon control and iron production that should not have been possible with the tools available, techniques that produce a quality of iron that European metallurgists did not achieve until centuries later. When archaeologists asked elder Ogun priests how these techniques were developed, the answer was consistent across generations, across geography. Ogun showed us.
Not a metaphor they were willing to unpack, not a poetic way of saying their ancestors figured it out. A direct statement of spiritual transmission, of knowledge accessed through ceremony, through prayer, through the altered states of consciousness that the Ogun tradition specifically cultivates. Modern cognitive scientists studying creativity and problem-solving have identified a specific state, sometimes called hypnagogic consciousness, in which the brain makes connections that ordinary waking thought cannot access. A state that inventors, artists, and scientists across history have described as the source of their most important insights. Thomas Edison used to hold steel balls above metal bowls when he napped, so they'd fall and wake him at the precise edge of sleep, in that fertile in-between state. The Ogun tradition has been deliberately cultivating that state for 3,000 years, in building extraordinary things with what they found there.
The Yoruba Mother of Waters, protector of children and guardian of the ocean. She is the oldest memory the African continent carries, and she has an ocean named after her that stretches from one end of the world to the other. Yemoja, Mother of Waters. Origin of all Yoruba Orishas, all divine powers are said to have emerged. In some traditions, she is the mother of Oshun. In others, she is the source before the source, the water before water had a name. And here is the part that history has never adequately explained. When enslaved Yoruba people were loaded onto ships at the West African coast, taken from their land, their families, their language, their everything, many of them held on to one thing more fiercely than any other: Yemoja. They took her with them across the Middle Passage. They rebuilt her worship in the Caribbean. They called her Yemoja in Brazil, La Sirene in Haiti, Yemoja in Uruguay, where today in 2025, tens of thousands of people gather at the beach on February 2nd every year to leave offerings at the ocean's edge. Not as museum exhibit, not as cultural performance, as living faith. Now ask yourself the question that historians rarely ask: what kind of spiritual force survives the most brutal campaign of cultural destruction in human history, survives the Middle Passage, slavery, colonization, forced conversion, the deliberate destruction of African identity across 4 centuries, and comes out the other side, still being practiced by millions of people on multiple continents? Not preserved, not reconstructed, continued. What kind of power does that? Yemoja does not require explanation. She requires witness. The ancient Egyptian god of wisdom, writing, and the architecture of reality. But here is what history never told you. Everything we have covered so far, every Yoruba deity, every spiritual tradition, every documented phenomenon exists within one specific cultural context. But there is an older context, much older. Before the Yoruba traditions were formalized, before the kingdoms of West Africa rose to power, before the trade routes connected the continent's civilizations into the vast network that colonial cartographers would later pretend didn't exist, there was Kemet, ancient Egypt. And in Kemet, there was a god so significant, so cosmically central, that the ancient Greeks, when they encountered his tradition, renamed him after their own god Hermes and called the resulting synthesis the source of all hidden wisdom. His name was Jehuti. The world calls him Thoth. Thoth was not simply a god of writing in the way we imagine writing, words on a page. He was the force that the ancient Egyptians believed structured reality itself, the divine intelligence that spoke the laws of the universe into existence, the record keeper of what is, what was, and what must be. He was depicted with the head of an ibis, a bird whose beak curves in the exact shape of the crescent moon, the first instrument ancient Egyptians used to measure time. That is not coincidence. In the ancient Egyptian mind, there were no coincidences. There was only pattern and your ability to read it. And here is where the story becomes genuinely difficult to explain.
The ancient Egyptians attributed to Thoth the creation of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, and writing, not as cultural achievements developed over centuries of trial and error, but as knowledge transmitted directly from divine intelligence to human consciousness. Modern Egyptologists have found ancient Egyptian mathematical texts that contain solutions to problems, specific geometric and algebraic relationships that should not have been solvable with the conceptual tools available to that civilization at that time. The calculations exist, the answers are correct, the methodology is missing, as if someone gave them the answer and they worked backward. The Hermetic tradition, which traces directly to the Thoth-Jehuti worship of ancient Egypt, produced texts called the Hermetic corpus that influenced Isaac Newton, who spent more time studying them than he did studying physics, that influenced Carl Jung, that founded the foundational thinking of Western philosophy. The secret wisdom of Thoth, supposedly erased, supposedly primitive, is embedded in the intellectual foundations of the civilization that tried to erase it. The ibis remembers.
The Akan god of stories, strategy, and the subversive power of intelligence. Now, I need you to pay close attention to this one, because this is the one that changes everything. Anansi, the spider god of the Akan people of West Africa, Ghana, Ivory Coast, and their diaspora across the Atlantic world. On the surface, Anansi appears to be the trickster, the storyteller, the small, clever spider who outwits gods and kings and monsters with cunning rather than strength. That is what they allowed to survive in the public record. What they buried, what required the full machinery of colonial cultural suppression to keep from circulating, was the deeper function that Anansi served. In the original Akan tradition, Anansi was not simply a storyteller, he was the owner of all stories. Every story that exists, every narrative, every history, every account of what happened and why, belonged to Anansi. And in Akan cosmology, to own the story was to own the power. Because here is what the Akan understood that colonial administrators found terrifying. Whoever controls the narrative controls reality. Whoever tells the story of what happened decides what it means. Whoever names a thing owns it. Anansi's mythology was specifically and deliberately designed to transmit this knowledge, particularly to people in positions of powerlessness. His stories were not entertainment, they were survival technology, manuals for how to operate when you have no conventional power, no army, no official authority. And they were effective. When enslaved Akan people arrived in the Caribbean and the Americas, they brought Anansi with them. His stories mutated, adapted, integrated with local traditions, but their core function remained constant, teaching powerless people how to be ungovernable. Teaching communities under colonial authority how to think strategically, how to deceive oppressive power, how to win when winning is supposedly impossible. Scholars of the Caribbean independence movements have noted, quietly in footnotes, because saying it too directly makes too many people uncomfortable, that the strategic thinking embedded in Anansi traditions correlates strongly with the successful resistance strategies of communities that managed to free themselves. A spider god whose stories taught people how to be free. That is why they tried to bury him. And that is why in Ghana, in Jamaica, in Suriname, in African American folklore as Anansi transforms into Brer Rabbit, he is still exactly where he has always been. Spinning, watching, waiting for the next story that needs to be told.
The Akan supreme being and the consciousness that holds all things. And now we arrive at the seventh, the one that contains all the others. Every tradition we have explored, Shango's lightning, Oshun's rivers, Ogun's iron, Yemoja's ocean, Thoth's wisdom, Anansi's stories, all of them exist within a larger framework, a supreme consciousness, a unifying force. The Akan call it Nyame. And what the Akan tradition says about Nyame is something that modern theoretical physics, specifically quantum field theory, has spent the last century arriving at from a completely different direction.
Nyame is not a god who lives somewhere above the world and intervenes occasionally. Nyame is the fabric, the field, the intelligence that is woven into the structure of everything, that does not stand apart from creation, but is identical with it. That is not a king in the sky, but the consciousness in which all things occur. The Akan symbol of Nyame, the J Nyame symbol, one of the Adinkra symbols of West Africa, translates approximately as, "Except for God, I fear none." But its deeper meaning is, nothing was before God, nothing will be after. Not a statement of religious submission, a statement of cosmological fact. Now here is the part that should make you sit very still. In 1944, physicist Erwin Schrödinger, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, published a book called What is Life?, in which he argued that the universe appears to operate as if it possesses a form of unified consciousness, that the separation between observer and observed is an illusion, that at the fundamental level of reality, everything is participating in everything else. He was saying in the language of physics what the Akan had been saying about Nyame for over 1,000 years. In 1970, physicist David Bohm proposed what he called the implicate order, the idea that beneath the visible, separate world of objects and events, there is an unbroken wholeness, a unified field of intelligence from which all apparent separations emerge. The Akan elders who heard about Bohm's work had the same response as the Yoruba elders who heard about water memory. We know. We have always known. We simply said it differently. What modern physics is slowly, carefully, institutionally approaching, ancient African spiritual philosophy arrived at thousands of years ago, and was then systematically dismissed as myth, as primitive, as the belief system of people who did not yet understand the world. The irony is so complete, so total, so devastating, that it has its own kind of power. What all seven have in common. Now I need you to step back, because individually, each of these forces is extraordinary, but together, seen as a system, they reveal something that goes beyond any individual deity, any single tradition, any specific culture.
Look at the pattern. Shango governs justice and atmospheric electricity, and modern science is only beginning to understand the relationship between consciousness and electromagnetic fields. Oshun governs water and fertility, and modern medicine is only beginning to understand the relationship between water's molecular behavior and human biology. Ogun governs iron and technology, and what we know of ancient African metallurgy still contains techniques we cannot fully reverse engineer. Yemoja governs the ocean and collective survival, and the survival rate of her tradition across the most brutal cultural destruction in history remains statistically inexplicable. Thoth governs mathematics and cosmic law, and his attributed knowledge appears embedded in mathematical texts that predate the conceptual framework required to produce them. Anansi governs narrative and strategy, and the resistance movements his stories informed achieved results that conventional power analysis said should have been impossible. Nyame governs the unified field of consciousness, and theoretical physics is slowly confirming the cosmological model his tradition encoded thousands of years ago. This is not 7 separate superstitions from 7 separate cultures. This is a unified body of knowledge encoded in story, in ritual, in symbol, in ceremony that maps the architecture of reality with a precision that Western science is only now developing the tools to verify. And it was almost erased, not accidentally, not through neglect, deliberately, systematically, with the full force of colonial intellectual machinery applied specifically to ensuring that these traditions were dismissed, disrupted, and removed from the educational systems of the people they belonged to. Why would you work that hard to erase something that was merely primitive superstition? You wouldn't.
You erase something because it is powerful. You erase something because it works. You erase something because if the people who carry it fully understand what they are carrying, they will never be governable again.
There is a grandmother somewhere right now, in Lagos, in Accra, in Kingston, in Sao Paulo, in New Orleans, who is doing something that looks ordinary. Cooking, singing, laying offerings at the base of a tree or the edge of a river, tying something to a door frame, speaking a name her grandmother taught her, who learned it from her grandmother, in an unbroken line stretching back across the Atlantic, across the Middle Passage, across centuries of people who were told their traditions were worthless, and kept them anyway. That grandmother is not practicing superstition. She is maintaining a library. She is preserving a technology. She is keeping alive a body of knowledge that survived everything they threw at it. Fire, forced conversion, cultural annihilation, centuries of institutional dismissal. Because it is true. The 7 forces we explored today, Shango, Oshun, Ogun, Yemoja, Thoth, Anansi, Nyame, are not historical curiosities. They are not the charming mythology of a civilization that has since been superseded. They are maps. Maps of consciousness, maps of natural law, maps of how power operates, how communities survive, how human beings access the full range of what they are capable of. Maps that certain forces worked very hard to ensure you never received. You received them today. What you do with them is yours to decide. Before you go, I need to ask you something. Of the 7 forces we explored today, which one felt most familiar to you? Not familiar like you knew the name, familiar like something in you recognized what was being described, like a door opening onto a room you would somehow been in before. Tell me in the comments, because that recognition is not random. That is memory. That is the tradition working exactly the way it was designed to work, finding you across time, across distance, across everything that was done to separate you from it. And I need you to notice something before you close this video. The fact that you watched this far, the fact that something in you needed to hear these names, needed to know these stories, that is not accident. That is the pattern doing what it has always done, finding the people who are ready to carry it forward, exactly the way it was designed to work, finding you across time, across distance, across everything that was done to separate you from it. And I need you to notice something before you close this video. The fact that you watched this far, the fact that something in you needed to hear these names, needed to know these stories, that is not accident. That is the pattern doing what it has always done, finding the people who are ready to carry it forward. If this story gave you something, if it returned something to you that you didn't know was missing, subscribe to this channel, because there are hundreds more names waiting to be spoken, hundreds more traditions that were buried before they could reach the people they belong to, hundreds more maps that were hidden before you could read them. This is where we find them. This is where we speak them back into existence. And this is where we make certain that this time they are not forgotten. Because there are hundreds more names waiting to be spoken, hundreds more traditions that were buried before they could reach the people they belong to, hundreds more maps that were hidden before you could read them. This is where we find them. This is where we speak them back into existence. And this is where we make certain that this time they are not forgotten. The 7 gods whose powers still can't be explained. Perhaps they were never meant to be explained. Perhaps they were only ever meant to be lived.